Welcome to my channel Sleep Audio Stories. Thank you for watching. Video, subscribe, and like my channel.
To be Accounted For by Ahmed Abdullah. It was now his custom to sit by the open window. He would look out into the mean cramped streets, at the jerry-built houses, and up at the high, sharp-contoured sky, which seemed to be always packed with dirty clouds. Then he would pity himself and hate the rest of the world. He despised the present, yet he clutched at it with both hands, and was surprised and irritated because he could not get away from the past, and the tale of the past, the shame of it, was hot and acrid in his brain. That's why he sat by the window. That's why he soaked his ears and his soul in the terrible muffled noise of the great city. Those sounds of death and hate, of love and joy, and the sharp drumbeats of 1,000-armed businesses. At least they spelled a living, pulsing world. There were men there, and women, and, in a measure, they comforted him because he did not know them, and because they did not know him. So he felt safe with them. He could look at them without blushing. It was only when he turned his back to the window, when he shut out the world from his ears and his eyes, when he felt the choking, mephitic solitude of the four walls that he thought, and he did not like to think. For here, in the little grey room on East 11th, with his back to the world of strangers who crowded the streets, he saw the life which he lived as he was living it, and it was mainly expressed by the furniture which packed its corners. The iron bed, the gangrened deal table, the ridiculous spindle-legged bureau, and the horrible fly-specked chromos on the walls. Then he thought, of course, of the little cabinet in his mother's salon, back there in the castle of the Puy de Dôme. The little glass cabinet, all filled with Tangara statuettes, cups of Ming celadon, enamel from Norway, Meissen and Serb's china, and boxes in vernis Martin. Dry, lifeless things they were, representing so and so much money and so much skill and artistry. But to him they meant more. They meant the brave, clanking hopes of his youth. They meant the name and the pride of the family to which he belonged. His memory had ensouled them with a softness, a throbbing which was deeper than the heart of woman. For they meant to him the things he had lost. They meant to him the things he had thrown away, the things he had hurt and cheated and polluted, the name he had disgraced, the escutcheon he had fouled, the mother, cold and haughty, dry-eyed and thin-lipped, who had given up everything for him, and given up in vain, the sister, bitter and dowerless, forced into the convent which she hated and feared, the younger brother who had to sacrifice the diplomatic career for which he had been trained, to go into the office of a fat agent de change who patronized him and bullied him because of the noble name he bore. Why, even the little glass cabinet had been sold. Even the dun-coloured Tangara statues, the boxes in vernis Martin, the glasses of Gallet d'Annecy, and the many other objects of virtue. The forests had been sold, the fields, the paintings, the famed wine-cellar, finally the house itself, the huge grey castle which had housed one of his name and race since the days of Pepin the Bold. Only the keeper's lodge remained, and there, in the damp, flat-roofed hovel, built of rough-hewn stones, his mother lived now, lived like a peasant woman. And he was here, in New York, worthless and nameless. He clenched his fists. He gave a little cry of impotent fury. Then he laughed. He thought of the life insurance agent, who somehow had drifted up to his room that very morning and had tried to insure him against death. The fool! To ask a man to protect himself against the only hopeful, the only pure moment of life. His memory swayed up into the past as the sea sways to the touch of the moon. It had been cards at first, and afterward the little ivory ball which dropped so noiselessly, so fatefully. 24 noirs impair pass. Those foolish words, and the bits of gaudy pasteboard. What a tragedy they held! What a record of weakness and selfishness and self-contempt! He felt a pulling, selfish satisfaction in convincing himself that it had not been an inborn passion with him, that it had not even been his own fault. During his school years and during the years spent at the military academy, he had never touched a card, even during his first 10 months of actual army life. After he had received his commission in the 43rd Infantry, he had never thought of them, had never used them. Came the manoeuvres, the long, heart-breaking marches, the bivouac at night, and then one evening the drawling voice of his company commander, Captain Xavier Lesieur, asking him if he played cards, baccarat by preference. "Non, mon capitaine," Lesieur had laughed. "Very well, my little innocent Provençal. You must learn. We must have a little distraction. I'll teach you baccarat. Nothing to it. Simply watch the nines and look sharp after the naturals. You'll get the hang of it in no time." The rules of the game had been simple indeed. He had mastered them inside a few minutes, and the other congratulated him on his quickness. So he had played, and he had lost. "Never mind," the captain had consoled him. "We must all stump up for our apprenticeship." The play had been small, and that first day he had not lost much, just a few gold pieces, which did not worry him. But the next evening some cavalrymen had dropped in. They were wealthy men, sons of Norman farmers and Lyons bankers. They had forced the game again and again until finally the roof was the limit. He had lost more than the rest. He had wired to his mother, and she had promptly remitted. Her husband had been in the army, her father, her grandfather. She knew, she understood. She even laughed a little at the tragic wording of the telegram which he had sent. "We must all grow up, my boy," she had told him on his visit home in October, when he had taken a short leave to shoot birds. "A little cards will not hurt you. We're not paupers." At the end of the manoeuvres his regiment had been sent to Paris. There had been more cards, more losses. Again he had been forced to write home. This time there was no ready money in the bank. His mother had been forced to sell some forest land. He was the first son, after all. The estate was his. And he had played again. He had tried to win back what he had lost, and that not because he was greedy after either money or cards, but simply because his people were not over-wealthy, and he wanted to recuperate what he had lost. So he had made a study of cards. He had the cold, logical Latin mind, and set himself to do the thing in earnest. He learned poker, 30 et 40, and then he joined the Cercle Richelieu, and passed night after night playing roulette. Steadily he had lost. Steadily his mother had sold acres and acres of forest land, then a few rich acres his family owned in Corsica, and finally the vineyard of her father in the Champagne country, which had been her dowry, and which she had meant to pass on as a dower to her only daughter. That also had gone. But she had not complained. Cold and haughty, he was her firstborn son. His was the name, the title, the traditions. He must keep up his position among those shopkeepers who crowded the army since the Empire had given way to the Republic. Let him play, let him lose. Presently he would settle down. He would marry a wealthy bourgeoisie, and, with her money, he would buy back everything he had lost in gambling. She had already picked out a bride for him. He had laughed light-heartedly. "And what does she look like, the little one?" "What difference does it make? You will not marry her for her looks. You will marry her because it is your duty to yourself and to your family." Then, with light heart, he had returned to Paris, and had gambled more than ever. "Enfant," he said to himself, "soon I shall have to settle down and marry. Then I shall have to quit the army and Paris, and all the fun, and cultivate my paternal acres in the Puy de Dôme, and wear gaiters and altogether be an animal of a farmer. Therefore, vogue la galère. Let's play and let the devil take the hindmost. The end of it all had been sudden, shockingly unexpected. A large sum, gold and paper and IOUs, had been on the green cloth. One more ace, he thought, studying his hand, and the pot would be his. Enough to buy back every acre his mother had been forced to sell. Enough to give back his sister's dowry. Enough to give a decent life competence for the little brother who was studying for the diplomatic service. Enough to release him from a loveless marriage. Just the one pot, the one big gain, and he would never again touch cards. Just the ace, that was all he needed. And it was there, in full view in front of him. His right-hand neighbour had dropped out of the game, and had thrown down his cards upside down. He had turned the trick very clumsily. There was a shout, a roar, a sharp, cutting word. "You cheat, monsieur! You cheat!" That had been the end of it all. Of course, there had been no court-martial. Nothing of that sort ever happened in the 43rd Infantry. That regiment never preferred charges against brother officers. They washed their dirty linen in private. Just the colonel's hard, dry words. "Adieu. The 43rd does not want you. Nor does the army, nor does France." And his mother, haughty, stone-faced, thin-lipped, dry-eyed, had echoed the simple words. "The Puy de Dôme does not want you. Your family does not want you." A little pause. "I do not want you, my son." She had settled his debts, and it had ruined her. She had paid his passage to America. Now he was here, in the little grey room on East 11th, looking at the strangers who crowded the streets, and thinking of France, of his mother, of his regiment. He picked up the afternoon paper. He studied the contents, though he knew them by heart. They were fighting under the walls of Lille. They were hanging on by their teeth. One report mentioned the 43rd Infantry, cut to pieces in a gallant charge. There were 3 lines devoted to the colonel, killed in action. It was the colonel who had told him, "The 43rd does not want you, nor the army, nor France." Oh yes, he remembered that, would always remember it. He laid down the paper. His head sank on his breast. Vague shadows seemed to come from the distance. They enfolded him. They took his breath away. He shut his eyes. Somewhere to the east, he thought it very strange, he could hear voices singing, "Amour sacré de la patrie." Oh, yes, the marching song of the 43rd. They were fighting down there, near Lille, hanging on by their teeth. There was a sound like the tearing of fine silk, a shrieking and whistling, then a sickening thud. Sergeant Castell wiped his powder-blackened brows. He inserted another cartridge in his rifle, drew a bead, and fired. Then he turned to Lagrange, the lance-jack. "The end, mon vieux. Presently they will eat us up." Lagrange had no time to reply. His elbow was in continuous, jerky motion. Load, fire, load, fire. There was another tearing whistling noise, then a thud and a gurgle. This time it had done for Lesieur, the company commander. Castell looked at the stark figure. "The last of them, the last of the officers!" Lagrange paused between shots. His rifle was red-hot. It needed cooling. Half a cigarette was stuck behind his left ear. He lit it and blew the smoke into the air. "Right, mon bougre. The last one indeed. And we need officers. God, what do I say? We need one officer. Just one to give the word, to lead, to charge." He sobbed. The tears flowed down into his thick, matted beard. "Just one officer, one." His voice snapped off in mid-air. He stared open-eyed. A trim, boyish figure rose from the trench, sword in hand. He waved it in circles. Fix bayonets! Charge, my boys, charge! Lagrange rubbed his eyes. He was utterly bewildered. But it is the little lieutenant. But he had been kicked out of the regiment. He could not understand it at all. Again he looked at the trim, boyish figure. Then he charged, together with the others, on toward that belching belt of fire. The servant girl knocked at the door, twice, 3 times. There was no answer. The landlady came. "Open up there, open up. You can't play possum with the likes of me. You pay your rent today, or—" Suddenly a great fear engulfed her. She called the police. They forced the door open. The Frenchman was dead. A bullet had pierced his heart. No weapon was found in his room. No trace of the assassin was ever found. But the doctor who examined the body shook his head. "Can't account for it," he murmured. "That bullet was fired from a great distance, from a very great distance, and yet there is no hole in window, nor door, nor wall." And then he entered the case in the little book which contained his private collection of inexplicable deaths.
The Last Ascent from Uncanny Tales. The extraordinary rapidity with which a successful airman may achieve fame was well shown in the case of my friend Radcliffe Thorpe. One week known merely to a few friends as a clever young engineer, the next his name was on the lips of the civilized world. His first success was followed by a series of remarkable feats, of which his flight above the Atlantic, his race with the torpedo boat destroyers across the North Sea, and his sensational display during the military manoeuvres on Salisbury Plain impressed his name and personality firmly upon the fickle minds of the public, and explains the tremendous excitement caused by his inexplicable disappearance during the great aviation meeting at Attercliffe near London towards the end of the summer. Few people, I suppose, have forgotten the facts. For some time previously he had been devoting himself more especially to ascending to as great a height as possible. He held all the records for height, and it was known that at Attercliffe he meant to endeavour to eclipse his own achievements. It was a lovely day, not a breath of wind stirring, not a cloud in the sky. We saw him start, we saw him fly up and up in great sweeping spirals. We saw him climb higher and even higher into the azure space. We watched him, those of us whose eyes could bear the strain, as he dwindled to a dot and a speck, till at last he passed beyond sight. It was a stirring thing to see a man thus storm, as it were, the walls of heaven and probe the very mysteries of space. I remember I felt quite annoyed with someone who was taking a cinematograph record. It seemed such a sordid, business-like thing to be doing at such a moment. Presently, the aeroplane came into sight again and was greeted with a sudden roar of cheering. "He is doing a glide down," someone cried excitedly, and though someone else declared that a glide from such a height was unthinkable and impossible, yet it was soon plain that the first speaker was right. Down through unimaginable thousands of feet, straight and swift, swept the machine, making such a sweep as the eagle in its pride would never have dared. People held their breath to watch, expecting every moment some catastrophe. But the machine kept on an even keel, and in a few moments I joined with the others in a wild rush to the field at a little distance where the machine, like a mighty bird, had alighted easily and safely. But when we reached it, we doubted our own eyes, our own sanity. There was no sign anywhere of Radcliffe Thorpe. No one knew what to say. We looked blankly at our neighbours, and one man got down on his hands and knees and peered under the body of the machine, as if he suspected Radcliffe of hiding there. Then the chairman of the meeting, Lord Fallowfield, made a curious discovery. "Look," he said in a high, shaken voice. "The steering wheel is jammed." It was true. The steering wheel had been carefully fastened in one position, and the lever controlling the planes had also been fixed so as to hold them at the right angle for a downward glide. That was strange enough, but in face of the mystery of Radcliffe's disappearance, little attention was paid it. Where, then, was its pilot? That was the question that was filling everybody's mind. He had vanished as utterly as vanishes the mist one sees rising in the sunshine. It was supposed he must have fallen from his seat. But as to how that had happened, how it was that no fragment of his body or his clothing was ever found, above all, how it was that his aeroplane had returned, the engine cut off, the plane secured in correct position, no even moderately plausible explanation was ever put forward. The loss to aeronautics was felt to be severe. From childhood, Radcliffe had shown that, in addition to this, he had a marked aptitude for drawing, usually held at the service of his profession, but now and again exercised in producing sketches of his friends. Among those who knew him privately, he was fairly popular, though not perhaps so much so as he deserved. Certainly he had a way of talking shop, which was a trifle tiring to those who did not figure the world as one vast engineering problem, while with women he was apt to be brusque and short-mannered. My surprise, then, can be imagined when, calling one afternoon on him and having to wait a little, I had noticed lying on his desk a crayon sketch of a woman's face. It was a very lovely face, the features almost perfect, and yet there was about it something unearthly and spectral that was curiously disturbing. "Smitten at last?" I asked jestingly, and yet aware of a certain odd discomfort. When he saw what I was looking at, he went very pale. "Who is it?" I asked. "Oh, just someone," he answered. He took the sketch from me, looked at it, frowned, and locked it away. As he seemed unwilling to pursue the subject, I went on to talk of the business I had come about, and I congratulated him on his flight of the day before, in which he had broken the record for height. As I was going, he said, "By the way, that sketch, what did you think of it?" "Why, that you'd better be careful," I answered, laughing, "or you'll be falling from your high estate of bachelordom." He gave so violent a start, his face expressed so much of apprehension and dismay, that I stared at him blankly. Recovering himself with an effort, he stammered out, "It's not... it's an imaginary portrait." "Then," I said, amazed in my turn, "you've a jolly sight more imagination than anyone ever credited you with." The incident remained in my mind. As a matter of fact, practical Radcliffe Thorpe, absorbed in questions of strain and ease, his head full of cylinders and wheels and ratchets, and the Lord knows what else, would have seemed to me the last man on earth to create that haunting, strange, unearthly face, human in form, but not in expression. It was about this time that Radcliffe began to give so much attention to the making of very high flights. His favourite time was in the early morning, as soon as it was light. Then in the chill dawn he would rise and soar and wing his flight high and ever higher, up and up, till the eye could no longer follow his ascent. I remember he made one of these strange solitary flights when I was spending the weekend with him at his cottage near the Attercliffe Aviation Grounds. I had come down from town somewhat late the night before, and I remember that just before we went to bed we went out for a few minutes to enjoy the beauty of a perfect night. The moon was shining in a clear sky. Not a sound or a breath disturbed the sublime quietude. In the south one wondrous star gleamed low on the horizon. Neither of us spoke. It was enough to drink in the beauty of such rare perfection, and I noticed how Radcliffe kept his eyes fixed upwards on the dark blue vault of space. "Are you longing to be up there?" I asked him jestingly. He started and flushed, and he then went very pale, and to my surprise I saw that he was shivering. "You're getting cold," I said. "We had better go in." He nodded without answering, and as we turned to go in, I heard quite plainly and distinctly a low, strange laugh, a laugh full of a honeyed sweetness that yet thrilled me with great fear. "What's that?" I said, stopping short. "What?" Radcliffe asked. "Someone laughed," I said, and I stared all round and then upwards. "I thought it came from up there," I said in a bewildered way, pointing upwards. He gave me an odd look, and without answering went into the cottage. He had said nothing of having planned any flight for the next morning, but in the early morning, the chill and grey dawn, I was roused by the drumming of his engine. At once I jumped out of bed and ran to the window. The machine was raising itself lightly and easily from the ground. I watched him wing his godlike way up through the still, soft air till he was lost from view. Then, after a time, I saw him emerge again from those immensities of space. He came down in one long, majestic sweep and alighted in a field a little way from the house, leaving the aeroplane for his mechanics to fetch up presently. "Hello," I greeted him. "Why didn't you tell me you were going up?" As I spoke, I heard plainly and distinctly, as plainly as ever I heard anything in my life, that low, strange laugh that I had heard before. So silvery sweet and yet somehow so horrible. "What's that?" I said, stopping short and staring blankly upwards. For, absurd though it seems, that weird sound seemed to come floating down from an infinite height above us. "Not high enough," he muttered like a man in an ecstasy. "Not high enough yet." He walked away from me then without another word. When I entered the cottage, he was seated at the table sketching a woman's face, the same face I had seen in that other sketch of his, spectral, unreal, and lovely. "What on earth?" I began. "Nothing on earth," he answered in a strange voice. Then he laughed and jumped up and tore his sketch across. He seemed quite his old self again, chatty and pleasant, and with his old passion for talking shop. He launched into a long explanation of some scheme he had in mind for securing automatic balancing. I never told anyone about that strange, mocking laugh. In fact, I had almost forgotten the incident altogether when something brought every detail back to my memory. I had a letter from a person who signed himself George Barnes. Barnes, it seemed, was the operator who had taken the pictures of that last ascent, and as he understood I had been Mr. Thorpe's greatest friend, he wanted to see me. Certain expressions in the letter aroused my curiosity. I replied. He asked for an appointment at a time that was not very convenient, and finally I arranged to call at his house one evening. It was one of those smart little 6-room villas of which so many have been put up in the London suburbs of late. Barnes was buying it on the instalment system, and I quite won his heart by complimenting him on it. But for that, I doubt if anything would have come of my visit, for he was plainly nervous and ill at ease and very repentant of ever having said anything. But after my compliment to the house, we got on better. "It's on my mind," he said. "I shan't be easy till someone else knows." We were in the front room where a good fire was burning. In my honour, I guessed, for the apartment had not the air of being much used. On the table were some photographs. Barnes showed them me. They were enlargements from those he had taken of poor Radcliffe's last ascent. "They've been shown all over the world," he said. "Millions of people have seen them." "Well?" I said. "But there's one no one has seen. No one except me." He produced another print and gave it to me. I glanced at it. It seemed much like the others, having been apparently one of the last of the series, taken when the aeroplane was at a great height. The only thing in which it differed from the others was that it seemed a trifle blurred. "A poor one," I said. "It's misty." "Look at the mist," he said. I did so. Slowly, very slowly, I began to see that misty appearance had a shape, a form. Even as I looked, I saw the features of a human countenance, and yet not human either. So spectral was it, so unreal and strange. I felt the blood run cold in my veins and the hair bristle on the scalp of my head, for I recognized beyond all doubt that this face on the photograph was the same as that Radcliffe had sketched. The resemblance was absolute. No one who had seen the one could mistake the other. "You see it?" Barnes muttered, and his face was almost as pale as mine. "There's a woman," I stammered. "A woman floating in the air by his side. Her arms are held out to him." "Yes," Barnes said. "Who was she?" The print slipped from my hands and fluttered to the ground. Barnes picked it up and put it in the fire. Was it fancy, or as it flared up and burned and was consumed, did I really hear a faint laugh floating downwards from the upper air? "I destroyed the negative," Barnes said, "and I told my boss something had gone wrong with it. No one else has seen that photograph but you and me, and now no one ever will."
A Grim Race with Death. The Grey Rider, by Charles Hilland Craig. His name was Lear. He was the world's greatest racing driver, and it was said of him that he was utterly devoid of nerves. For 3 years he had been the leader among the speed demons of the surface tracks, and during those 3 years he had won every race in which his car had finished. Several times accidents had sent him to the pits to stay. Again he had been rammed by a driver who lost control. But whenever he finished the race, it was in the lead. Through the land he was known to the sporting public as King Lear, to his more intimate friends simply as the King. He no longer needed the money which came to him through racing, but rather drove for the sheer zest of driving. There was a thrill for him in every turn on any speedway, a double thrill every time he came thundering into the straightaway. As he raced, he laughed, and he was a man who still could laugh when he finished the last lap on the great brick oval at the capital of the racing world. Laugh while ready hands unbent the fingers that clutched the wheel in a death-like grip. Without nerves was King Lear, they said, and there was little reason to deny that bold statement. For he was a man who went out in front and stayed there till the race was over, or something had broken. No tremendous spurts, no sneaking, no jockeying. Lear clamped down on the accelerator and held it there. Little wonder he got a thrill from those terrible turns, for he went into them faster than any other living man, and lived. Less strange, the double thrill from the straightaway, for his car was a weaving phantom when he came from the turns, a gray mist when he went into the next. Lear was perhaps 35 years old at the time of which I write, and had been racing for about 10 years. It was nearer the end of the racing season, and he was in the next to last race of the year, when he first saw the man whom he intuitively dubbed the Grey Rider. He had paid little attention to the other entries. It made no difference to him who they were, or in what numbers. He would beat them all, barring accident. He was on the 60th lap of a 250-mile grind, when first his attention was attracted by this Grey Rider, who was to be his chief competitor in the next race. The car was gray, not the gray which bright enamel usually gives, but a drab gray, a sordid gray. The car was low-slung, and apparently awkwardly built. King Lear found himself criticizing as he swung past that car on the 60th lap. The man was deep down in the seat, barely showing his head. But he also was gray, and he seemed to be laughing as Lear swept past him. An uncomfortable thought welled up in the mind of the king that there was a sardonic something about this man and his car that he could not fathom. But he swept the thought away and settled down to finish ahead. They were on the 90th lap when the gray car almost rammed him, and he swung into the fence, splintering it and ripping off a wheel. With anger in his heart, he made ready to protest, but the gray rider had swept from the track and was waiting for him, having left the race. "I'm sorry," he said. Lear's anger dissipated like a mist. He laughed. "Maybe it wasn't your fault," he said, and took the mental stock of the other driver. The gray dust had settled finally on the driver's face. The hair, just visible on the turned-up helmet, was gray. Under the gray of that face, there were tiny wrinkles. The face was set as though it had come from a mold, granite. Hours of grim intensity at the taped wheel had seen to that. "What's your name?" asked Lear. He was surprised that he had never seen this man before. Perhaps some new chap breaking into the game. "Gray," answered the gray rider, and to Lear it appeared that for a moment a sardonic smile touched the thin lips. He didn't like that smile. There was something... He had intended to look the man up, to ask Angus about him, but somehow he didn't do it. A reason why he should now want to find out who and what the fellow racer was didn't occur to him. He, who had never given a hang what was put against him in a race. Angus, his team manager, had come a-running. "What happened?" he had said, and Lear replied, "I almost got rammed." "What?" And there had been on the face of Angus a strange expression of wonder and doubt. Lear had looked about for Gray, but the man was gone. Speed, more speed. That was what was killing Lear. Cars were not built fast enough for him. Time after time in races, he had ruined cars, driving them to the ultimate limit of their endurance until they had burned out beneath him. Wrecked many times, but he seemed to have the lives of a cat. He always came through. His god was speed. "It'll get you yet," said Angus again and again. "You can't keep up those stunts and live. Take it from me, boy. If you don't quiet down on the curves, you'll go through the big gates someday." This from Angus, who was continuously exhorting his other drivers to show a little pep. Lear laughed. But then, that was Lear. That was why he was the best-loved driver in America. The crowd came to see speed, and he was there to show it to them. But deep down in his heart, he knew that Angus was right. Too near, many times, was death. For now that the great American classic race had been run at an average rate of more than 100 miles per hour, the ultimate speed on wheels was fast being attained. Little more could be expected of a machine that clung to earth. Yet Lear still asked for speed. To see him drive in a race was to see something never to be forgotten. He always smiled as he rode. Of course, the crowd couldn't see that, but they knew, for the press agents had long been busy. All the crowd could see was a blur as the red car swept past the stands, but they knew he was smiling at death as he rode. And from east to west, men came to watch him ride like a red whirlwind to victory. And then the last 500-mile race of the season, on a new board track in California. The team managed by Angus was entered, and, of course, Lear was expected to win. As the day of the race neared, there came into the mind of Lear a question. Would the gray rider be in the race? Why he wondered about this he did not know. He had never questioned before. He did not ask Angus about it, for he knew that a query now about the other entries would serve to make the fiery little Scotsman wonder if he were losing his iron nerve. He didn't read the newspapers. He didn't read the bulletins. He never read anything. All he cared to do was race. All he had ever desired was to sit behind the wheel of his little red cannon and thunder to victory. He had never cared who it was he was racing. Speed, More speed. He would shatter that 500-mile record to fragments. He would show them that his red cannon could show its heels to any car ever built. And as he thought of it in his last trial spin before the big race, he involuntarily increased his pace, till the other cars, the fence, the empty stands became gray blurs. Faster, 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 round the curve, into the long straightaway, past the stands again. Faster, faster. And then he knew instinctively, as Angus had flagged him in, that he had ridden at a pace never before equaled by man. The day came. The hour was at hand. The time for the big race. Car after car drew up to the pits for final adjustments. Car after car was trundled to the starting line. Drivers smoking a last cigarette. Mechanics pottering about. The drone of the cars ready to go. The officials lined them up, Lear and his red wagon in the first tier, the others stretching to the side and behind. The gray rider? Lear looked about. Yes, there he was at the outside of the first tier, and Lear was puzzled. That made an extra car in the first row. Not safe. An official was beside him. "What's the idea of the extra car there?" he asked. "Which car?" asked the official. "Gray one, number 31, outside." The official looked where he pointed and laughed, said something which Lear did not catch. But Lear laughed too. He had never been accused of lack of sportsmanship. What did he care if the first tier was jammed from pole to stand? He was going to burn them all up. Win. But as he sat there looking at the gray rider, there came over him a sensation he had never known before. A scarcely felt impression of impending disaster. Somehow, deep down within him, he felt that this would be his last race. But he shook off the feeling with a laugh of disdain, lighted a cigarette, and waited. There sounded the last preliminary signal. The track was cleared. A sputtering roar, and they were off. Round the track, a drone string of angry motors, following the pacer. A vast thunder of sound. They passed the starting line, and the flag dropped down and up again. A dull roar from the crowd, screaming of exhaust. Whining throbs of motors, gray film of smoke, gray cloud of dust. Speed, more speed. Mile after mile, lap after lap, and the gray rider had nosed up and was running close to Lear. A gray shadow stalking him, urging him on, and he responded. His car changed from a red streak to a misty blur as he thundered around the track. 110, 20, 30, 40, speed, and the gray shadow still stalked him, lacking the necessary spurt to go around. A car went through a fence on the death curve. Another went over and over when a tire blew out. But by superb skill, Lear and the gray rider missed the wreckage and went on and on. Speed, speed to the utmost. Into the pits for new tires and gas, then back to the grind, back to the race with the gray shadow, which was challenging his superior skill. They passed the 180th lap, the 190th, 10 laps to go, and on the straightaway the gray rider passed Lear. The smile left Lear's face. His teeth set hard. His dark face was a mass of tiny wrinkles. He leaned forward. But his car did not respond. He held grimly at the rear wheel of the gray car, but could do no better. Wildly, recklessly on the curves, a raging demon in the stretch. It availed nothing. The Grey Rider was just as reckless, just as superb in his handling of the gray car. 5 laps to go. 3 laps. 2 laps. 1 lap. And the spring on his foot feed broke. He could feel it go. Wide open, his car thundered on. He reached over to shut off the power, but at that moment the Grey Rider's eyes looked into his. He could feel rather than see the sardonic challenge in those eyes. He gripped again the wheel, careening wildly into the curve. How he made it he did not know, but he came out. A mere touch would send him tumbling into the fence. At the rear wheel of the gray car, he wanted speed and couldn't get it. Speed. Down the stretch he roared like the wind, and then he began to gain. Gain. His radiator was even with the driver's seat of the leading car. A little more. He did not hear the roar of the race, had no ears for the thunder of the 100,000 people mad with the thrill of speed. He could think of nothing but the sardonic smile which he felt must have been on the face of the Grey Rider. Slowly he gained, but too late. The checkered flag went down, but the Grey Rider had drawn it. A low snarl escaped Lear's lips as he realized that he had lost. Then the snarl changed to an exclamation of horror as the Grey Rider shot in front of him. He started to slow down, forgetting that his foot feed was no longer working. Sharply, he twisted the wheel and went broadside into the Grey Rider. He heard a tremendous roar, the clang of steel on steel, smelt the odor of blazing gasoline, felt its wrath sear his lungs, saw stars shooting across his vision. Saw, too, felt the sardonic smile of the man who had beaten him. Lear regained consciousness for only a few minutes at the hospital. Angus was there with him, firmly solicitous. "Lost," gasped Lear. "Lost, hell," said Angus. "You won." "But the gray car, 31, beat me out just before I crashed into him." Angus looked puzzled. "There wasn't any 31 in the race," he said. "And you didn't crash anyone. You hit the fence." "But the Grey Rider—" "There wasn't any Grey Rider." "But there must have been." Lear knew that Angus was lying. No Grey Rider? The fool. Why, look, there was the Grey Rider beside Angus now, his arm on Angus's shoulder. The Grey Rider, grey with dust, grey with sternness, a sardonic smile that was upon his face. But the grey eyes which shone through the goggles held no mirth. They were cold as death. "He's beside you," cried Lear hoarsely. "Look, Angus." Angus turned around in utter amazement. There was no one there. "Why, Lear!" Lear was dead.
Charles Ashmore's Trail by Ambrose Bierce. The family of Christian Ashmore consisted of his wife, his mother, 2 grown daughters, and a son of 16 years. They lived in Troy, New York, were well-to-do, respectable persons, and had many friends, some of whom, reading these lines, will doubtless learn for the first time the extraordinary fate of the young man. From Troy, the Ashmores moved in 1871 or 1872 to Richmond, Indiana, and a year or 2 later to the vicinity of Quincy, Illinois, where Mr. Ashmore bought a farm and lived on it. At some little distance from the farmhouse was a spring, with a constant flow of clear, cold water, whence the family derived its supply for domestic use at all seasons. On the evening of the 9th of November in 1878, at about 9 o'clock, young Charles Ashmore left the family circle about the hearth, took a tin bucket and started toward the spring. As he did not return, the family became uneasy, and going to the door by which he had left the house, his father called, without receiving an answer. He then lighted a lantern, and with the eldest daughter, Martha, who insisted on accompanying him, went in search. A light snow had fallen, obliterating the path, but making the young man's trail conspicuous. Each footprint was plainly defined. After going a little more than halfway, perhaps 75 yards, the father, who was in advance, halted, and elevating his lantern, stood peering intently into the darkness ahead. "What is the matter, father?" the girl asked. This was the matter. The trail of the young man had abruptly ended, and all beyond was smooth, unbroken snow. The last footprints were as conspicuous as any in the line. The very nail marks were distinctly visible. Mr. Ashmore looked upward, shading his eyes with his hat held between them and the lantern. The stars were shining. There was not a cloud in the sky. He was denied the explanation which had suggested itself, doubtful as it would have been, a new snowfall with a limit so plainly defined. Taking a wide circuit round the ultimate track so as to leave them undisturbed for further examination, the man proceeded to the spring, the girl following, weak and terrified. Neither had spoken a word of what both had observed. The spring was covered with ice, hours old. Returning to the house, they noted the appearance of the snow on both sides of the trail its entire length. No tracks led away from it. The morning light showed nothing more. Smooth, spotless, unbroken, the shallow snow lay everywhere. 4 days later, the grief-stricken mother herself went to the spring for water. She came back and related that, in passing the spot where the footprints had ended, she had heard the voice of her son and had been eagerly calling to him, wandering about the place, as she had fancied the voice to be now in one direction, now in another, until she was exhausted with fatigue and emotion. Questioned as to what the voice had said, she was unable to tell, yet averred that the words were perfectly distinct. In a moment the entire family was at the place, but nothing was heard, and the voice was believed to be an hallucination caused by the mother's great anxiety and her disordered nerves. But for months afterward, at irregular intervals of a few days, the voice was heard by the several members of the family and by others. All declared it unmistakably the voice of Charles Ashmore. All agreed that it seemed to come from a great distance, faintly, yet with entire distinctness of articulation. Yet none could determine its direction nor repeat its words. The intervals of silence grew longer and longer, the voice fainter and farther, and by midsummer it was heard no more. If anybody knows the fate of Charles Ashmore, it is probably his mother. She is dead. The Thing at Nolan by Ambrose Bierce. To the south of where the road between Leesville and Hardy in the state of Missouri crosses the east fork of May Creek stands an abandoned house. Nobody has lived in it since the summer of 1879, and it is fast going to pieces. For some 3 years before the date mentioned above, it was occupied by the family of Charles May, from one of whose ancestors the creek near which it stands took its name. Mr. May's family consisted of a wife, an adult son, and 2 young girls. The son's name was John. The names of the daughters are unknown to the writer of the sketch. John May was of a morose and surly disposition, not easily moved to anger, but having an uncommon gift of sullen, implacable hate. His father was quite otherwise, of a sunny, jovial disposition, but with a quick temper like a sudden flame kindled in a wisp of straw, which consumes it in a flash and is no more. He cherished no resentments, and, his anger gone, was quick to make overtures for reconciliation. He had a brother living nearby who was unlike him in respect of all this, and it was a current witticism in the neighbourhood that John had inherited his disposition from his uncle. One day, a misunderstanding arose between father and son. Harsh words ensued, and the father struck the son full in the face with his fist. John quietly wiped away the blood that followed the blow, fixed his eyes upon the already penitent offender, and said with cold composure, "You will die for that." The words were overheard by two brothers named Jackson, who were approaching the men at the moment, but seeing them engaged in a quarrel, they retired, apparently unobserved. Charles May afterward related the unfortunate occurrence to his wife and explained that he had apologized to the son for the hasty blow, but without avail. The young man not only rejected his overtures, but refused to withdraw his terrible threat. Nevertheless, there was no open rupture of relations. John continued living with the family, and things went on very much as before. One Sunday morning in June 1879, about 2 weeks after what has been related, May Sr. left the house immediately after breakfast, taking a spade. He said he was going to make an excavation at a certain spring in a wood about a mile away, so that the cattle could obtain water. John remained in the house for some hours, variously occupied in shaving himself, writing letters, and reading a newspaper. His manner was very nearly what it usually was. Perhaps he was a trifle more sullen and surly. At 2 o'clock he left the house. At 5 he returned. For some reason not connected with any interest in his movements, and which is not now recalled, the time of his departure and that of his return were noted by his mother and sisters, as was attested at his trial for murder. It was observed that his clothing was wet in spots, as if, so the prosecution afterward pointed out, he had been removing bloodstains from it. His manner was strange, his look wild. He complained of illness, and going to his room took to his bed. May Sr. did not return. Later that evening, the nearest neighbours were aroused, and during that night and the following day, a search was prosecuted through the wood where the spring was. It resulted in little but the discovery of both men's footprints in the clay about the spring. John May, in the meantime, had grown rapidly worse, with what the local physician called brain fever, and in his delirium raved of murder, but did not say whom he conceived to have been murdered, nor whom he imagined to have done the deed. But his threat was recalled by the brothers Jackson, and he was arrested on suspicion, and a deputy sheriff put in charge of him at his home. Public opinion ran strongly against him, and but for his illness he would probably have been hanged by a mob. As it was, a meeting of the neighbours was held on Tuesday, and a committee appointed to watch the case and take such action at any time as circumstances might seem to warrant. On Wednesday, all was changed. From the town of Nolan, 8 miles away, came a story which put a quite different light on the matter. Nolan consisted of a schoolhouse, a blacksmith's shop, a store, and a half-dozen dwellings. The store was kept by one Henry Odell, a cousin of the elder May. On the afternoon of the Sunday of May's disappearance, Mr. Odell and 4 of his neighbours, men of credibility, were sitting in the store, smoking and talking. It was a warm day, and both the front and the back door were open. At about 3 o'clock, Charles May, who was well known to 3 of them, entered at the front door and passed out at the rear. He was without hat or coat. He did not look at them, nor return their greeting, a circumstance which did not surprise, for he was evidently seriously hurt. Above the left eyebrow was a wound, a deep gash from which the blood flowed, covering the whole left side of the face and neck and saturating his light grey shirt. Oddly enough, the thought uppermost in the minds of all was that he had been fighting and was going to the brook directly at the back of the store to wash himself. Perhaps there was a feeling of delicacy, a backwards etiquette which restrained them from following him to offer assistance. The court records, from which mainly this narrative is drawn, are silent as to anything but the fact. They waited for him to return, but he did not return. Bordering the brook behind the store is a forest extending for 6 miles back to the Medicine Lodge Hills. As soon as it became known in the neighbourhood of the missing man's dwelling that he had been seen in Nolan, there was a marked alteration in public sentiment and feeling. The Vigilance Committee went out of existence without the formality of a resolution. Search along the wooded bottomlands of May Creek was stopped, and nearly the entire male population of the region took to beating the bush about Nolan and in the Medicine Lodge Hills. But of the missing man, no trace was found. One of the strangest circumstances of this case is the formal indictment and trial of a man for murder of one whose body no human being professed to have seen, one not known to be dead. We are all more or less familiar with the vagaries and eccentricities of frontier law, but this instance, it is thought, is unique. However that may be, it is of record that on recovering from his illness, John May was indicted for the murder of his missing father. Counsel for the defence appears not to have demurred, and the case was tried on its merits. The prosecution was spiritless and perfunctory. The defence easily established, with regard to the deceased, an alibi. If, during the time in which John May must have killed Charles May, if he killed him at all, Charles May was miles away from where John May must have been, it is plain that the deceased must have come to his death at the hands of someone else. John May was acquitted, immediately left the country, and has never been heard of from that day. Shortly afterward, his mother and sisters removed to St. Louis. The farm, having passed into the possession of a man who owns the land adjoining and has a dwelling of his own, the May house has ever since been vacant and has the sombre reputation of being haunted. One day, after the May family had left the country, some boys playing in the woods along May Creek found concealed under a mass of dead leaves, but partly exposed by the rooting of hogs, a spade, nearly new and bright except for a spot on one edge which was rusted and stained with blood. The implement had the initials CM cut into the handle. This discovery renewed in some degree the public excitement of a few months before. The earth near the spot where the spade was found was carefully examined, and the result was the finding of the dead body of a man. It had been buried under 2 or 3 feet of soil, and the spot covered with a layer of dead leaves and twigs. There was but little decomposition, a fact attributed to some preservative property in the mineral-bearing soil. Above the left eyebrow was a wound, a deep gash from which blood had flowed, covering the whole left side of the face and neck, and saturating the light grey shirt. The skull had been cut through by the blow. The body was that of Charles May. But what was it that passed through Mr. Odell's store at Nolan?